Hi guys, how you doing? Welcome back to the Spurs Talk Show. I am Sean Butler. Bugsy Malone is off ice skating on puddles up ahead. It's cold today, guys. It's brutally cold. All of the waterlogged pitches here have turned to mini ice skating rinks. And so whilst this is actually episode 135 of Tottenham Walks, it may also turn out to be episode 1 of Tottenham Slips. If you do see me take a wobble or fall on my backside, then you'll know why. They're everywhere. It's precarious. Guys, do me a favour, please hit the like button if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, hit the notification bell if you'd like to stay abreast of the latest content, and also drop a comment, let me know your thoughts. A couple of topics today, guys. One of them is pretty easy to get through, Pedro Porro, and the other one is kind of, I guess, more conversational rather than fact, more speculative, opinion based, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. So the first one, Pedro Porro. Update from Fabrizio Romano. Excuse me, I've got a very itchy nose this morning. Pedro Porro. Apparently we're getting closer to signing him. Apparently Tottenham now have finally agreed and said that there's a willingness now to pay the minimum fee release clause, which is good news, I guess, because Sporting have made it entirely clear from the very start that they don't want to let him go, and the only way he leaves is if that fee is paid. The problem is now is that they're saying that they are willing to pay it, but can we please spread it over instalments, which would be the traditional way that anyone would do most negotiations. Most negotiations are not paid cash up front. If it's a £40 million transaction for a 5-year contract, you'll be paying Sporting £8 million a year, and you'll be paying the player whatever his salaries are, £8 million a year. So £16 million a year every year for 5 years, rather than £40 million up front and then £8 million a year in salaries or whatever. So the challenge is, right, is that when you have minimum fee release clauses, the selling club is under no obligation to negotiate in any way, shape or form, because they might not necessarily want to be making the trade in the first place. They are forced into it, and so they have every right to make it as difficult for the buying club as possible, and to make it as easy for them to be able to go and find a replacement for the player that they seem or deem as incredibly valuable to them. And so Amorim, I think his name is, the manager, is saying, no, I want the 40 million up front so I can go and replace him quickly and easily. But some of the people at Sporting Lisbon and the higher ups on the board are saying that there's actually a willingness to negotiate. I do still think it will drag on a little while longer yet. I'm hoping that Tottenham can figure out a way to get that kind of instalments policy put in place, because look, the problem with losing £40 million immediately, I know it's boring to a lot of people, but to me it's like a necessary conversation topic, because one hand washes the other, right? Your financial situation enables you to do what you can or can't do on the pitch or with regards to the team. And if you have to pay £40 million up front, it's a massive disruption to your cash flow. And cash flows for businesses of that size are usually like forecasted out, not just weeks in advance or months in advance, but years in advance. Every day they need to know what cash is in the business, what are their liabilities, where the money's going, what's it being paid for. Is it being paid for historical player trading purchases? Is there money coming in that regard? Paying for the infrastructure rebuilds or repairs or whatever? Is it paying for travel to games? Whatever, right? Everything that you could possibly think of needs to be identified and allocated into a cash flow forecast. And because Tottenham are not usually a team that pays minimum fee release clauses, they would not have forecast that sort of outlay in January as a one-off player trade transaction. So if they do that, if they do get that done in that regard, if Sporting hold out and then Tottenham end up paying £40 million up front, what does that do for the difficulty of making a second trade, a second player come in or go out? If you pay the 40 million up front, there's rumours today that Matt Doherty might be leaving the club and that he's valued at £15 million. Well, if you're forced to pay the £40 million up front, would Daniel Levy and ENIC require people who are going to buy Matt Doherty to pay them up front? Because they need that cash flow back. And if they do that, then it decreases the likelihood of Matt Doherty leaving the club by, many multiples. Does it also mean that it's less likely that Tottenham can go and buy Trossard? Is that the reason why we bid whatever it was, 12 million quid or 11 million quid for him, and Brighton want 25 million for a guy who's, well, actually no, I was going to say a guy who whose contract is up at the end of the summer, but I think they triggered an extension recently. So, but yeah, you understand my point. Those outlays, those cash flow disruptions, make it much more difficult to be able to come to the negotiation table for future transfers and have wiggle room to be able to keep the other club somewhat happy in that situation. So it's difficult, and I really hope that Daniel Levy and ENIC can figure out a way with the sporting board to come somewhere in the middle. They're going to get their 40 million, even if it's not entirely spread evenly across the course of the contract. Would you do 15 million up front and the other 25 over 8 years? Like, you hope that there's some ability to meet in the middle. And then you have to ask yourself, guys, like, is Pedro Porro the right guy for Tottenham? Well, he certainly is for a Conte system. Well, at least I think he is. Although you could argue, Conte would argue that he prefers people like Denzel Dumfries because they're more physical, stronger, faster, rather than kind of small and technical. But I don't think Denzel Dumfries would be a good fit for Tottenham, purely because I don't think he's a good player. But also, there is this overarching uncertainty of whether Conte will be here next year. And as far as I've been reading on Twitter from, relatively, I guess, higher up journalists who are more likely to know, they're saying that there's almost like a basic understanding that at the moment both parties, Conte and the leadership at Tottenham Hotspur, don't really see the purpose or the point in extending the contract beyond the 6 months at the moment, unless things change, because the visions of the two clubs, or the two parties rather, are so far apart. Unless new money comes into Tottenham Hotspur that can provide the necessary resources for Conte to completely rebuild, which, let's be honest guys, is going to cost 500 million, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But back to the point, unless that happens, there's every likelihood that Conte might just say, you know what, I can go somewhere else and rebuild a squad with the correct money, or with enough money. And so in that solution, do you really want Denzel Dumfries to be at the club next year, where he'd have to play as a right back in the event that one of the two most likely candidates to be Tottenham manager is either Thomas Tuchel or Pochettino, both of whom typically use a back four? I don't think Denzel Dumfries works in a back four, personally, but I think Pedro Porro could, very much so. Ideally, it wouldn't need to be that way. Ideally, you'd like to see a scenario where Conte is fully backed, Porro is the first of a string of signings, and that Conte lives happily ever after at Tottenham, and that where he is given that 3-year pathway, like everyone is calling for, using Mikel Arteta as the poster boy for patience. To me, just for what it's worth, giving someone time doesn't always equate to success. And it depends on how highly you prioritise enjoyment of watching football to see whether or not you're aligned with that motif. To me personally, I do think that watching good football is very important. I've always said that. And in an ideal world, you'd have sexy football that brings success. But like I say, unless you're going to back him to the tune of 500 million, which is probably what it's going to take, right? Because you're going to need a new goalkeeper. You're going to need at some point a new left wing back to help Udogie, because Sessegnon is dead wood and Perisic is probably only going to be here for another season. So that's at least 2. You need at least 2 centre-backs, if not 3, over the course of a couple of years. We're going to get the right wing back, so that's 6 players. Need at least 1 creative midfielder, that's 7. Need at least 1 forward, maybe 2, that's 9. Let's call it 8 players, just to be reasonable. 8 players that come in. If £60 million gets you the level of Richarlison, I don't think Richarlison is a top-class player. I don't think Richarlison gets into Man City's squad or anything like that, or Arsenal's squad perhaps. So, well, he would do now because they haven't got a striker really, but my point being that if that's the standard, £60 million gets you that standard, and it takes 100 million quid to get Mudryk, who's only played, was it 27 games or something for Shakhtar Donetsk? Something, I could be wrong on that, but that's the stat I heard. Then that's the inflation in football. That level of quality, you're going to need 8 times at least 50 million, but more likely 60 million. So you're going to need about £550 million spent over a very short period of time in order to close the gap, and that would be considered backing Conte. That is never going to happen at Tottenham Hotspur, because Tottenham Hotspur, well, it's never going to happen unless new money comes in, because Tottenham Hotspur as a brand, as a football club, will not be able to generate enough revenues to cover that outlay, let alone the salaries, let alone agents' fees and everything else. And so, to me, there's either 2 or 3 options really. One is you get new money that comes in that is preferably not leveraged debt, because that is betting the house on uncertain outcomes, and the risk reward for me on that is nowhere near palpable. You either go and get money from direct foreign ownership, probably Middle Eastern money. Although, to be honest, guys, there's not that many parties that are from that area that are unattached to either clubs in the Premier League or clubs in Europe that will play in the same European competitions that already don't have ownership elsewhere. And so I don't know, I'll have to do a research on this, but I'm pretty certain that there's not that many more sort of parties that could be set up that are not already attached or affiliated somewhere else with a conflict of interests, meaning that we would only be able to get a minimum, an insignificant, a minority investment from one of these parties, which leaves us with Daniel Levy and Enoch in charge of the football club, which is something that most people don't want. So it's not clear. So that massive rebuild that it's going to take, it's very murky to see how that comes about in a way that is plausible or realistic. The other option is that you accept the reality that Tottenham Hotspur are not that kind of club, and lower expectations and throw everything into youth development and all those things that we should be doing anyway but have failed at miserably. It's tough to see it. Well, the other option is that you go to a project manager, right? That Conte isn't the guy, and that you go and get somebody who is a better fit for a club that has to live within their means or chooses to live within their means. And and hopefully that guy plays good football, enjoyable football, because it's going to be a long time before you have any success, but at least you can enjoy attractive football in the process. And that guy would be the guy that you'd give 3, 4, 5 years to, rather than Conte, who I don't think is ever going to be happy. He's never going to feel satisfied or backed at Tottenham. It's difficult to know the right path, guys. I don't feel as depressed and as miserable as I did yesterday and the day before. The last 2 videos that I put out, especially the one that I did straight after the game when I was with Dave and Jack, I was miserable. Probably came across pretty depressing, so apologise about that. Not really my style too often to do that, but Now I'm just trying to think forward, trying to put my head around what's the best way to go, and it's murky, it's unclear. I think that what Tottenham need, what the fans want, is incredibly difficult to kind of envision how that happens in a very clean-cut way, where you get these owners and their risk tolerance, their minuscule risk tolerance out of the way, new owners that come in that also have that ability to throw money at it and not necessarily put us at risk financially with interest rates and all that stuff. Difficult. The climate is awkward, very awkward. We'll continue to figure it out, guys. Like, share and subscribe. I love you. I'll see you tomorrow for the Man City preview. As always, guys, as always, bye bye.